I have a little shop, and right now there is just no room for a lathe. I recently learned about segmented ring boxes and bowls and wanted to give them a shot, even though all the ones that I've seen were made with a lathe. I've made a bunch of conventional six-sided boxes, but never a round one before, and I thought I'd make one for my son. I had two problems to solve. First was how I was going to make the round box without a lathe, and then the second one was how I was going to make the actual rings. I had a pretty good idea about how to solve the first problem, so I got to work on the second one. A segmented ring is just a bunch of trapezoids glued together and then shaped. There's a lot of people online who sell jigs to cut those trapezoids precisely, but I wanted to try something different. I started with a segmented ring calculator that I found online. You input the diameter and how many segments it will be made with, and it gives you the dimension of the segments. I took that dimension and designed a part that I could 3D print. I took that plastic part to the shop and milled some of the same ash that I'm using in this video. I used the plastic segment to set the angle on my miter gauge to cut the strips I'd prepared. I ended up making about 8 million segments, I think. I glued them into rings and turned those rings into a cylinder. More on that later. Then I made a top and a bottom. I sanded and finished it and gave it to my son. He liked it. I liked it. My wife liked it. My daughter was ambivalent about it. Basically, it went just how I'd imagined. So I thought I was pretty smart. I'd figured I'd come up with a new way of cutting the segments that didn't rely on purchasing a jig, and I made the box without a lathe. Well, it turns out there's a reason why people are selling those jigs. I was trusting my eyes and my hands to set the miter gauge, and for a lot of projects, that works just fine, but not on this one, because if you're off by just a little bit, like a quarter of a degree in that angle, it is going to leave a huge gap, and that ring will never come together. I have no idea how I made that box that I gave to my son this way. It was just sheer blind luck, I guess. So it was back to the drawing board. I still didn't want to have to buy a jig to cut the segments accurately, so I designed one myself. I used that same online calculator to set the dimensions for a wedge that would fit inside the jig to set the proper angle. For a ring with 14 segments, the angle of the cut needs to be 12.86 degrees. I wanted the wedge to be something that I could reuse without worrying about it getting messed up, so I cut it out of acrylic on the laser. The process of cutting the segments is tedious. You cut one angle on one fence of the jig and then flip the wood strip around and cut the other angle on the other fence. And then carefully get the segments away from the blade. The segments wind up having a bunch of fuzzy ends from the table saw blade. I sanded each one to keep from having any glitches in the glue up. It takes a little bit of time. I think it'd be tough to glue up a ring with a lot more segments than this. But on this one, with 28 sides, Tight Bond 3 had enough open time that I could get them all clamped before they tacked up on me. I made these clamps out of some scrap wood and nylon rope. I drilled a hole through the length of the wood. I ran the rope through the hole and into another little piece of scrap to tighten the line. You pull it tight around the ring and then insert a rod or screwdriver between the rope and the scrap pieces and then turn the screwdriver. It will pull the slack out of the rope and tighten around the ring. It's not my idea. Lots of people have videos showing how to do it, and it works great. Once there's tension on the rope clamp, the screwdriver wants to unwind. So I use a quick release clamp to clamp the whole thing down to a workbench and then use the handle of that clamp to stop the screwdriver from moving and opening up the rope clamp on me. I mentioned before that I don't have any room for a lathe right now, but I'd like to get one eventually, and I'd like to get a big one. And I know that there are benchtop models and even mid-size lathes, but I know myself, and I've bought too many tools twice because I've started out with something that was perfectly adequate for my abilities at the time, but wouldn't really allow me to grow. So if I get a lathe, I intend to get one that will last me until I am all done and can lathe no longer. Back to the rings. I glued them up in stages because when they get glued, they are slippery. But I wasn't in a rush and didn't have a lot of room to mess these up based on the design. So to keep them aligned, I broke the glue up into stages. It turned out to be 3 rings for the body and 1 for the base, but more on that later. I used my laser to cut a template ring from some 1/4-inch MDF, and this was my answer to solving the no lathe problem. While the body rings were gluing up, I started on the inside of the base with the template and a flush trim bit on the router. Usually if I'm going to use a template on the router, I'll first clean up as much waste material as I can with the bandsaw. Unfortunately, with a closed ring, that's not possible. So I just nibbled away at the waste until it was close enough to the template so that I could just comfortably finish it off. After routing the inside of the base ring, I took the body rings out of their clamps and routed them inside and out with the same template. I made the base of the box out of some 1/4-inch plywood cut into circles on the laser. I used a rabbiting bit to cut a 1/4-inch rebate inside of the base ring that was a little bit deeper than the thickness of the plywood. The idea behind this was that I wanted to be able to put the plywood inside of the box without being able to see that it was there from the outside. Another way to have achieved this would have been to make a deeper rebate on the bottom of the base ring and place the plywood in that way, but the edges of the plywood would have been visible and I didn't want that. I cut some rings out of faux leather and glued them to the base pieces. I wanted to line the inside of the box with the same faux leather I used on the bottom. I struggled with how to put it on the inside of the cylinder of the box without seeing the edges of the leather when the box was open. I decided to cut a shallow rebate that started and ended about an eighth of an inch from the inside, top, and bottom of the main body of the box. That rebate is only about the thickness of the faux leather. Cutting the leather so that it fits inside of the cylinder perfectly was tricky. I had a hard time getting the cut straight because the material wanted to stretch and bend when I was holding it down. I give props to the people who do this well because I struggled with it for sure, but I finally got it. I used some painter's tape to clamp down the material while the glue dried. You can see a few test boxes that I made on the back of the bench. These were rough and were just meant to understand the process, and I learned a lot from them. I glued the bottom ring to the body of the boxes, and I was careful to align the brick pattern properly. Once they were dry, I took them to the router table to flush trim the rough outside of the bottom ring to the rest of the box. I waited to do this so that there was no chance that the bottom wouldn't align with the top. For the top, I found some scrap walnut that I had and I milled it into blanks. I designed the top so that it would have a slightly smaller diameter than the outside of the box. I also milled some ash blanks for the top as well. The top will have two parts. The ash will fit inside of a pocket on the bottom of the walnut. The ash will then fit into the box, holding the top in place. There's also going to be a little design detail with the ash poking out through the top. You'll see that in a minute. I cut the round parts of the top on the CNC router. I glued the ash into the pockets, and when they were dry, I got to work on the other side of the tops. I marked center for the CNC router to align properly and cut a small dish shape with a slot running across it. I'll install a handle there later. I milled a strip of ash that I'll use for that handle. I rounded the edges on the router table. I also rounded over the edges of the walnut tops. Once the tops were sanded and ready, I continued working on the handles. I wanted to round over the edges on the router table, but that can be tricky when you have a piece of wood that small. So I grabbed an old 2x4 and I chiseled out a slot for the handle to fit into. That way I'll route a much larger piece with the coping sled and not need to worry about losing fingers in the process. Once that was done, I did some light sanding on the handles. I smeared a little glue on them and clamped them into the tops. I can only imagine that a lathe makes sanding a cylinder pretty easy, but I made do with what I had. I sanded down to 220 grit and I water popped the grain and then repeated the final grit. I also put a small chamfer on the bottom edge of the box. I like this look because it kind of adds a shadow line to the base. I tried out a finish I've never used before. It's Osmo Pollux High Solid in raw matte. It's meant to keep lighter wood from the yellowing you get from most oil-based finishes. I think it did a pretty good job. I prefer the darker color that those same oils give to walnut, but I wasn't going to mix finishes on this, so the whole thing got the Osmo. That's my first project here. Came out pretty good. There was definitely a lot of things to learn. Never worked with this fake leather before, and that was pretty interesting. Just cutting it straight was pretty hard. Yeah, it was fun. I think this is the second or third thing that I've ever done with segmented rings. I learned a lot. I think it came out okay. But that's it. It was a fun project. Looking forward to making more, and thanks for watching.